The certified letters from the HOA arrived daily, each detailing new violations Michael hadn't known existed. Apparently, his doorbell was an unauthorized model. His recycling bin had been left out 7 minutes past the designated collection window. The HOA had even measured the grass in front of his condo with a ruler and found it 1/4 inch too tall. Meanwhile, the warehouse parking situation had become a free-for-all. Cars appeared and disappeared at all hours. Michael had installed new signs, only to find them vandalized or removed. He'd attempted to block off sections with safety cones, but they'd been tossed aside. When he'd installed a chain across one entrance, it had been cut. At the repair shop where he still worked full-time, Michael's employee Diego looked up from the disemboweled laptop he was fixing. "My cousin's a tow truck driver," he offered after hearing Michael's latest parking lot saga. Just saying. But Michael wasn't ready to go nuclear. Not yet. Instead, he tried reason one last time, approaching Cynthia after a chance encounter at the local grocery store. "I'd like to propose a compromise," he said, intercepting her in the produce section. "Designated spots for HOA use during scheduled events, with proper notice." Cynthia examined an avocado with exaggerated attention. "The board has considered your situation," she replied. "We've decided to offer you $600,000 for the warehouse property. It's very generous given the current market." Michael nearly laughed. "It's worth twice that, minimum." "Is it?" Cynthia raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "With all those structural issues." "What structural issues?" "The ones the county inspector is likely to find next week," Cynthia said, placing the avocado in her cart. "Anonymous tips about commercial properties are taken very seriously, as are noise complaints, fire code violations, and reports of potential environmental hazards." The implied threat hung between them like a thundercloud. "You can't intimidate me into selling," Michael said softly. "Perhaps not," Cynthia conceded, "but I can certainly make ownership painful. Those HOA fines on your condo are just the beginning. By the way, how's your credit score? Unpaid HOA dues can be such a burden on one's financial profile." As she glided away toward organic kale, Michael stood frozen, crushed tomato in hand. The next morning brought the final straw. Michael arrived at the warehouse to meet Eliza Wong, an investor interested in partnering on converting part of the space into a tech incubator. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a chance to expand his repair business while creating something innovative with the property. They couldn't even reach the building. Cars filled every space. Pickup trucks lined the loading dock. Someone had parked a vintage Airstream trailer near the side entrance. A catering truck was setting up for what appeared to be another event. Eliza surveyed the chaotic scene. "This is not what I expected." "I can explain," Michael began. "No need," she replied, already checking her phone. "I appreciate the time, but I need a space that's move-in ready. This clearly has complications." As Eliza drove away, Michael stood in the middle of his unusable property, watching a teenager in an Oak Ridge Heights community pool shirt unload folding chairs from a minivan. His phone pinged with a text from Cynthia. "Revised offer, $550,000. The property's issues seem to be multiplying. Best to cut your losses." Michael took a deep breath and called Diego. "About your cousin with the tow truck. Is he free tomorrow?" Michael didn't sleep that night. Instead, he meticulously prepared, driven by a cold fury that had replaced his usual easygoing nature. First, he consulted with Diana Chen, an attorney specializing in property disputes. "Your case is straightforward," she assured him, reviewing his documentation. "They have no legal right to use your property without permission. That HOA retaliation against your condo is clearly actionable harassment." Next, Michael applied for every necessary permit and authorization for proper parking enforcement. He commissioned legal signage that met all county requirements and had it installed at 5:00 a.m. by a security team that would remain on site. By 8:00 a.m., he delivered a formal cease and desist letter to each HOA board member's home address, detailing the harassment and property violations with timestamps, photographs, and witness statements. A separate letter informed them that unauthorized vehicles would be towed beginning at noon, giving 4 hours notice as legally required. At 11:30 am, Michael stood in his warehouse lot, watching the drama unfold. Residents had begun arriving, reading the signs with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Several tried removing the notices, only to be intercepted by the security guards Michael had hired. Cynthia's Mercedes screeched into the lot at 11:47. She stormed toward Michael, designer handbag swinging like a weapon. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving a cease and desist letter. "Exactly what it says," Michael replied calmly. "This unauthorized parking situation ends today. You can't do this. People have nowhere else to park for the charity lunch." "The charity lunch you scheduled on private property without permission?" Michael asked. "That unauthorized event?" Cynthia's face flushed. "I've already called our attorney. We'll sue you for everything you've got." "I look forward to discovery," Michael replied, "especially the part where you explain to a judge how you organized the removal of legal property notices and led a harassment campaign against a property owner who wouldn't sell to you at a quarter of market value." At precisely noon, as if choreographed for maximum dramatic effect, 5 tow trucks rumbled into the lot from different entrances, forming a perfect perimeter. Diego's cousin Ramon stepped out of the lead truck, clipboard in hand. "This is your last chance," Michael told the stunned crowd that had gathered. "Move your vehicles now, or they'll be towed at owner's expense. Retrieval fee is $275, plus $85 daily storage." What followed was pandemonium. People rushed to their cars. Cynthia screamed into her phone. The catering truck hastily packed up, leaving half-assembled sandwich platters behind. But not everyone made it in time. By 1:30 p.m., 27 vehicles had been towed, including a Jaguar that belonged to HOA Vice President Gerald Williams, and Cynthia's Mercedes, which she deliberately left in place as a protest. By mid-afternoon, Michael's phone had 43 missed calls and 67 text messages. He ignored them all, instead meeting with the county inspector who'd arrived for a pre-scheduled walkthrough, an inspector Michael had requested weeks earlier as part of his proper renovation planning. "Place has good bones," the inspector noted, signing off on the initial approval forms. "Whoever told you there were structural issues didn't know what they were talking about." At 5:00 p.m., Michael finally answered his phone, a call from Diana Chen. "The HOA board is demanding an emergency meeting," she reported, amusement evident in her voice. "Apparently, they've had a misunderstanding and want to resolve this amicably." "I'm willing to meet," Michael replied, "but not at their clubhouse. They can come to my warehouse." 7:00 p.m. At 6:59 p.m., 5 ashen-faced HOA board members filed into the warehouse, led by a subdued Cynthia. They sat awkwardly on folding chairs facing Michael and Diana across a makeshift conference table. "Let's be clear," Diana began. "My client has documented dozens of instances of harassment, trespassing, vandalism, and attempted coercion. We're prepared to file suit first thing tomorrow, unless an agreement is reached tonight." Gerald Williams cleared his throat. "Perhaps we've been overzealous in our community management approach." "Overzealous?" Michael echoed. "You threatened my livelihood, attempted to force me to sell valuable property at a fraction of its worth, and organized systematic harassment through abusive HOA violations. What exactly do you want?" Cynthia asked quietly. Her earlier confidence evaporated. Michael slid a document across the table. "This is my proposal. First, all HOA fines against my condo are dropped immediately, and my account shown as being in good standing. Second, the HOA will pay for the replacement of the signs and security equipment that was vandalized, totaling $3,850. The board members exchanged nervous glances as Michael continued. "Third, I'm willing to establish a legitimate parking agreement for special events, maximum 10 per year, with 14 days written notice and proper insurance coverage. The HOA will pay market rate for the use, $500 per event." "That's outrageous," Gerald sputtered. "Fourth, Michael continued as if uninterrupted. Cynthia resigns from the board, effective immediately. The room fell silent. And if we refuse? Cynthia asked, her voice barely audible. Diana smiled thinly. Then tomorrow we file suit naming each of you personally for harassment and tortious interference with business. We'll subpoena all HOA records, personal communications, and financial transactions related to this property. The publicity alone should be illuminating. It took less than 20 minutes for the board to agree to Michael's terms. 6 months later, the warehouse had been transformed. 1/3 housed Michael's expanded tech repair business, now specializing in commercial equipment. Another section had become a successful coworking space. The remaining area was leased to a local artisan marketplace. The parking lot, clearly marked and properly managed, included 30 designated overflow spaces at the new HOA board, led by a reform-minded resident who'd had her own car towed that fateful day, could reserve for community events with proper notice and payment. As for Cynthia, neighborhood gossip held that she'd put her house on the market just weeks after the incident, only to discover that her own aggressive enforcement of HOA rules had made her property significantly less attractive to buyers. It eventually sold for well below asking price. On the anniversary of the Great Towing incident, Michael hosted a good neighbor open house at the warehouse. Every attendee received a custom keychain featuring a tiny tow truck and the phrase, "Parking by permission only." The keychains were Cynthia's idea. After months of therapy and self-reflection, she'd approached Michael with a sincere apology and an offer to make amends. She now managed the artisan marketplace in his building, where her organizational skills were put to positive use. The most coveted parking spot, right by the front door, remained permanently reserved for a gleaming Mercedes with a new vanity plate, Hume build. By week 3 of warehouse ownership, Michael's initial goodwill had evaporated. What had started as a few cars had morphed into a daily invasion. Range Rovers, BMWs, and Mercedes claimed the prime spots as if entitled to them. Twice, cars had blocked the main entrance entirely. The breaking point came when Michael arrived with a prospective HVAC contractor to quote building renovations, only to find a catering van parked directly against the loading dock, making it impossible to bring equipment inside. This happens often, the contractor asked, checking his watch. Not for much longer, Michael replied. That afternoon, Michael installed 4 professionally printed signs. Private property. No UBIC PRKNK. He placed security cameras at key points around the building and sent a polite but firm email to the HOA board detailing the new parking restrictions. The response came at 6:42 the next morning, an incoming call from Cynthia. Your signs have caused quite a stir, she said without preamble. Mrs. Fitzgerald from Oak Ridge Lane says they're visually aggressive. They're standard private property notices, Michael countered, watching through his apartment window as rain pounded the pavement outside. Great day to be having this conversation in his pajamas. The Architectural Review Committee hasn't approved their design or placement. Cynthia continued as if he hadn't spoken. You're in violation of community standards. The warehouse isn't part of your HOA, Michael said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug emblazoned with World's Okayest Employee, a gag gift from his former staff. It's commercially zoned and exempt from your regulations. That's technically correct, Cynthia admitted, but your condo isn't exempt. How long have those azaleas by your front step been dying? The bylaws are quite clear about maintaining living plants in designated landscaping areas. Michael nearly spilled his coffee. Are you threatening me? Of course not, Cynthia replied smoothly. Just reminding you that good neighbors look out for each other. The association has been interested in purchasing that warehouse for years. Frank was unreasonable about the price. I'd hoped you might be more practical. 2 days later, Michael's signs had vanished. The security camera footage showed a landscaping crew removing them at 5:30 am, directed by a woman in a familiar pastel cardigan. By the weekend, the situation had deteriorated further. Michael arrived at the warehouse to find a full-blown garden party underway in his parking lot. White tents, catering tables, and at least 50 cars parked haphazardly across the property. 3 men were unloading kegs near his loading dock. Michael spotted Cynthia directing a parking attendant in an HOA logoed vest. "This ends now," Michael announced, marching toward her. "Michael," Cynthia trilled with artificial delight, "you're just in time for our spring fling. There's mimosas by the tent." "You didn't request permission to use my property," Michael said, struggling to keep his voice level as curious onlookers gathered. "This is trespassing." "Don't be dramatic," Cynthia dismissed, lowering her voice. "Your uncle understood community obligations. This lot has served our needs for years." "My uncle isn't the owner anymore," Michael replied. "I am, and I want everyone off my property within the hour." Cynthia's smile vanished. "Make a scene at our community event, and you'll regret it. I can make your life very difficult." "You already have," Michael replied. "1 hour." He left Cynthia sputtering and retreated to his car, hands shaking with anger. On his condo voicemail, he found 3 messages from the HOA about violations: improper window coverings, unauthorized doormat design, and yes, those allegedly dying azaleas. The fines totaled $2,750. Michael Preston stared at the attorney across the polished mahogany desk, convinced he'd misheard. "I'm sorry. Uncle Frank left me what?" "The warehouse property at 1520 Industrial Way," the attorney repeated, sliding a folder across the desk. 10,000 square feet with surrounding lot, fully paid off. Assessed value of $1.2 million. Michael nearly choked. His life managing a struggling tech repair shop from his cramped apartment had left him perpetually counting pennies. Now this? His eccentric uncle, who'd vanished from family gatherings years ago after a legendary Christmas dinner argument with Michael's father, had somehow remembered him in his will. 3 days later, as Michael's beat-up Honda crunched across the gravel lot of his new property, he felt a surreal sense of disbelief. The warehouse was industrial chic, weathered brick with huge windows and an impressive steel loading dock. Far nicer than he'd expected. The interior smelled of machine oil and possibility, sunlight streaming through skylights onto concrete floors. As Michael circled the building, he noticed a sleek Mercedes parked near the side entrance, alongside several other vehicles scattered along the lot's perimeter. A woman in crisp linen pants and a pastel cardigan was affixing something to the side door. "Excuse me," Michael called out, quickening his pace. "This is private property." The woman turned, her expression shifting from surprise to something resembling indulgent amusement. "You must be Frank's nephew. I'm Cynthia Baxter, Oak Ridge Heights HOA president." She extended a manicured hand. "We've been managing community access to this parking area for some time now." Michael glanced at what she'd been posting. A laminated sign reading Oak Ridge Heights overflow parking. "I just inherited this property," Michael said, deliberately removing the sign, "and I don't recall authorizing any parking arrangements." Cynthia's smile never wavered, though it no longer reached her eyes. "Your uncle had an understanding with our community. We assumed it would continue. Perhaps you should attend tonight's HOA meeting. 7 o'clock at the clubhouse." She gestured toward the subdivision of luxury homes visible just beyond the property line. "I'll be there," Michael promised, watching as she slipped into the Mercedes and drove away, her personalized license plate, OLAKODGE1, gleaming in the afternoon sun. That evening, dressed in his least wrinkled button-down, Michael entered the plantation-style clubhouse to find 30 pairs of eyes instantly assessing his worth based on his footwear and smartphone model. "Everyone," Cynthia announced from her elevated position at the front table, "this is Michael Preston, Frank's nephew, and the new owner of the Industrial Way property. Michael has graciously agreed to continue our community parking arrangement." "Actually," Michael interrupted, feeling every inch the outsider, "I haven't agreed to anything yet. I'm still evaluating options for the property." A murmur rippled through the room. A silver-haired man in golf attire scoffed audibly. Cynthia's smile tightened. "Michael, perhaps you don't understand the situation. Your uncle's property has served as overflow parking for our community for years. We have limited street parking, and your lot has been essential for our residents' guests. especially during our numerous community events. I'm sure we can work something out for special occasions, Michael offered, but daily use ace. Wonderful. Cynthia cut in, banging her gavel. That's settled. Now, regarding the Anderson family's unauthorized wind chimes. As the meeting moved on, Michael caught Cynthia watching him with calculating eyes. He'd just been outmaneuvered, but this battle was far from over. The board members exchanged nervous glances as Michael continued. Third, I'm willing to establish a legitimate parking agreement for special events, maximum 10 per year, with 14 days written notice and proper insurance coverage. The HOA will pay market rate for the use, $500 per event. That's outrageous, Gerald sputtered. Fourth, Michael continued as if uninterrupted. Cynthia resigns from the board, effective immediately. The room fell silent. And if we refuse? Cynthia asked, her voice barely audible. Diana smiled thinly. Then tomorrow we file suit naming each of you personally for harassment and tortious interference with business. We'll subpoena all HOA records, personal communications, and financial transactions related to this property. The publicity alone should be illuminating. It took less than 20 minutes for the board to agree to Michael's terms. 6 months later, the warehouse had been transformed. 1/3 housed Michael's expanded tech repair business, now specializing in commercial equipment. Another section had become a successful co-working space. The remaining area was leased to a local artisan marketplace. The parking lot, clearly marked and properly managed, included 30 designated overflow spaces that the new HOA board, led by a reform-minded resident who'd had her own car towed that fateful day, could reserve for community events with proper notice and payment. As for Cynthia, neighborhood gossip held that she put her house on the market just weeks after the incident, only to discover that her own aggressive enforcement of HOA rules had made her property significantly less attractive to buyers. It eventually sold for well below asking price. On the anniversary of the Great Towing incident, Michael hosted a good neighbor open house at the warehouse. Every attendee received a custom keychain featuring a tiny tow truck and the phrase, "Parking by permission only." The keychains was Cynthia's idea. After months of therapy and self-reflection, she'd approached Michael with a sincere apology and an offer to make amends. She now managed the artisan marketplace in his building, where her organizational skills were put to positive use. The most coveted parking spot, right by the front door, remained permanently reserved for a gleaming Mercedes with a new vanity plate, Hume Bield.